The transmission came without warning. 1 second I was reviewing trade proposal number 47, a document so dull it made my eyes hurt, and the next second every screen in my office aboard Conclave Prime flickered to the same image. The Great Seal of the Galactic Council, gold and black, spinning slowly in the center of a red border. Red. The Council only used red for one category of business. Emergency session. All delegates to the main chamber. Immediately. My name is Raya Vasquez. I am, or was, depending on how the next hour went, humanity's only permanent observer diplomat aboard the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. I had held that position for 6 years. 6 years of sitting in a chamber built for species that towered over me, listening to debates conducted in languages my translator chip struggled to keep up with, watching decisions get made about star systems and trade routes and territorial rights, and raising my hand to speak exactly once per session, which was the maximum allowed for observer status representatives. Observer, not member, not delegate, observer. The word said everything. I walked the long corridor toward the main chamber. The floor was pale stone, polished so smooth it looked like frozen water, and my boots made a sharp sound with every step that echoed off the walls. I passed 2 Veth guards on their way to their posts. They were tall, silver-skinned, with forearms folded in the formal posture they adopted whenever something official was happening. One of them glanced at me. I smiled at him. His expression did not change. It never did. The main chamber of Conclave Prime was designed to make you feel small. That was not an accident. The ceiling rose 60 meters above the floor, and the seats for the 27-member species curved in a great arc around a central speaking platform. The platform itself was empty when I arrived, but the seats were filling fast. I found my station at the edge of the observer gallery, a narrow section off to the right, slightly lower than the main floor, with a clear view of everything and the ability to influence nothing. I pulled up my tablet and began taking notes. That was the one thing I could always do. I could always watch, and I could always write things down. The session opened at standard time. Council Elder Dara of the Veth took the central platform. She was the oldest living member of the oldest species on the Council, and she wore that fact like a weapon. Her posture was perfect. Her voice, when she spoke, carried without effort. Resolution 7 Omega, she said. This council convenes to address the ongoing and accelerating threat posed by the species designated human, native to the 3rd planet of the Sol system. Following 3 years of review, 412 incidents of protocol violation, and a unanimous recommendation from the Stability Committee, this resolution calls for the immediate and indefinite quarantine of the Sol system. The chamber was quiet. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of a decision already made. I kept my face still. My hand kept moving across my tablet, Dara continued. The charges were read by a junior Veth official who clearly found the whole thing distasteful. Humanity had violated expansion protocols by establishing 17 research stations beyond our designated development zone. Humanity had interfered in Kesson-Preethian trade negotiations by offering unsolicited medical assistance to a Kesson colony that had nothing to do with the negotiations. Humanity had formed unauthorized bilateral agreements with 6 non-council species. Humanity had exceeded the technology development ceiling for a species of our age category by a margin that the Stability Committee found, and I am quoting directly here, alarming and without precedent. And the last charge, the one that almost made me laugh, except that nothing about this was funny, was that humanity demonstrated uncontrolled social bonding behavior across species lines, destabilizing ancient social hierarchies and encouraging deviation from established order. We made friends. That was the charge. We made too many friends, and it worried them. The vote was called. 27 species. I watched each delegate tap their screen. The Prethian delegates voted yes immediately, their long fingers moving fast. The Solani cluster voted yes in block, all 4 of them pressing at once. Species after species. Yes, yes, yes. And then I saw what I had been watching for. 2 hesitations. Architect Sen of the Kesson, brilliant, sharp-eyed, insectoid, with a reputation for asking questions nobody else thought to ask, paused for 4 full seconds before voting. 4 seconds is nothing to a human. To a Kesson who process information at roughly 3 times human speed, 4 seconds is a very long time to hesitate. And Ambassador Leth of the Ohani, whose people had no permanent territory and wandered the outer systems in generation ships held together by engineering geniuses, and something that looked a lot like faith. Leth paused even longer. 5 seconds. Then voted yes, slowly, like someone who had decided something was necessary without believing it was right. I filed both of those observations in a place in my memory I would not forget. When the vote finished, 27-0, Elder Dara looked directly at the observer gallery. At me. The resolution passes, she said. As a courtesy, the human observer will be permitted 60 seconds to respond before this session closes. 60 seconds. I stood up. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. There was something cold moving through my chest, something that had claws in it. But underneath the cold, something else was waking up. Something steady and quiet that I recognized from every difficult moment in my life. A feeling I had always called, privately, the moment I stopped being afraid and start being useful. I walked to the edge of the observer gallery. I could not stand on the platform. That was not allowed. I stood at the railing, which put me slightly below everyone else in the room, which was also not an accident. I have been an observer in this chamber for 6 years, I said. My translator was set to broadcast in all 27 council languages simultaneously. I have followed every procedure. I have submitted 47 formal proposals through proper channels and received responses to none of them. I have watched this body make decisions about humanity's future without consulting a single human being, and I have done so with patience, because patience is something humans are quite good at. I looked at Elder Dara. You have made a mistake today, I said. Not because humanity is dangerous. We are not here to threaten anyone. You have made a mistake because you have misunderstood what we are. You looked at us and saw a problem to be contained. What you should have seen is a question you do not know how to answer yet, and the answer is coming whether you are ready or not. 60 seconds ended. The session closed. I turned around and found 2 Veth guards standing directly behind me. Commander Vasquez, one of them said in careful, formal, standard language. By authority of Resolution 7 Omega, you are hereby detained as a diplomatic representative of a quarantine system, pending review of your status. You will be escorted to temporary holding quarters. I looked at them. I thought about arguing. I thought about a lot of things in that 1 second. Then I nodded, picked up my tablet, and went with them. Because here is what nobody in that chamber understood yet. A cell is only a problem if you have nothing to do inside it. I had 47 rejected proposals, 6 years of council records, 1 partially memorized legal archive, and a very deep, very quiet certainty that they had just made the worst mistake of their long and comfortable lives. I was not frightened, I was thinking. And when humans start thinking, the only question worth asking is how long it takes before the thinking becomes something the galaxy can feel. The quarters they put me in were not cruel. That was the Veth way. They did not believe in cruelty when bureaucratic management could achieve the same result with less paperwork. The room had a bed, a desk, a narrow window that looked out at the slow rotation of the outer docking ring, and a terminal that had been carefully restricted to approved council communications only. The key word was approved. They had not thought to restrict the council's own legal library. It was an oversight so obvious that it told me something important. They expected me to sit quietly and wait for whatever process they had designed to run its course. They expected me to behave like a representative of a species that had just been put in its place. They expected a lot of things about humans that had never once been accurate. I opened the legal archive on the first morning and started reading, not aimlessly. I had a specific target. Every governing body in history had been built on documents, and every document had gaps, and gaps were where the future lived. 3 weeks in, I found what I was looking for. But I will come to that later. During those early weeks, I was not the only one working. I know what was happening on Earth because of Sen. Architect Sen, whose hesitation during the vote I had cataloged carefully, made contact with me through the internal council messaging system 11 days after my detention began. The message was brief and technically sent under the pretense of a routine diplomatic status inquiry, which was within his rights as a council member to file. But the last line of the message was not part of any standard inquiry form. It said, I have colleagues in the Sol Monitoring Division who owe me professional courtesies. If you require information about your home system, I am available for a follow-up discussion. I replied within the minute. Yes, please. What Sen told me over the following weeks, in short, careful messages that he disguised as procedural follow-ups, was this. Earth had received the quarantine declaration. The global response had taken approximately 4 days to organize itself, which any council observer should have found suspicious. Because a species that had just been handed an existential political sentence by the most powerful governing body in the galaxy should have needed more than 4 days to form a coherent reaction. But humans had not spent those 4 days in grief or confusion. They had spent them in logistics. The quarantine relied on controlling access to the Galactic Council's FTL relay network. the web of buoy stations that allowed faster-than-light communication and navigation across council-controlled space. Without access to the network, a species was effectively isolated. No trade ships could find their way in. No signals could get out. The blockade was total, and as far as the Council was concerned, airtight. What the Council did not know, what they had never thought to look for, was that Earth had never fully depended on their network. Not because humans had planned for this specific situation, but because humans plan for every situation, always as a matter of basic engineering habit. When you build a system that you depend on, you also build a backup. When you build a backup, you build a redundancy for the backup. It is not paranoia. It is just how human engineers sleep at night. Earth had a private FTL relay network. It was smaller than the Council's. It was less elegant. It had been built in pieces over 40 years, quietly, the way you build things when you are working on a project that nobody else is paying attention to. It did not cover the whole galaxy. It covered the systems that mattered to Earth. Trade partners, research stations, colony outposts, and a handful of non-Council species who had done business with humans long enough to trust them. The Council found out about the backup network 18 days after the quarantine began, when a monitoring probe detected unauthorized FTL traffic in Sol's outer system. They sent a technical team to disable the relay buoys. The team found 17 buoys in the outer system and deactivated all of them. They also found, in the process, that the buoys they were disabling were already 3 generations old. Earth had moved on to the next version before the Council even knew what they were looking at. By the time the Council's technical team returned to Conclave Prime to report their findings, Earth's third network was already partially operational. I received this information from Sen, and I sat with it for a long time, because it told me something that I needed to be certain of before I allowed myself to feel any relief. It told me that Earth was not panicking. Panic would have produced a military response, or a political one, some kind of visible emotional reaction that the Council could point to as confirmation of their fears. Instead, Earth had done what humans do when faced with a wall. They had quietly started building a door. But there was something else in Sen's messages. Something that I had not expected, and that changed the direction of everything I was planning. The quarantine vote, Sen told me, had not been unanimous in conscience. It had been unanimous on paper. 3 of the species that voted yes had been presented, in private sessions held 2 days before the main vote, with a clear message from the Veth leadership. Vote in favor or face immediate trade sanctions and a review of their council standing. These 3 species, the Marathi, the Sovan, and the Drakel, were smaller civilizations with economies that could not survive an economic blockade. They had voted yes because they had no real choice. This mattered. It mattered enormously. The Council had framed the quarantine as a unified galactic decision, a consensus of every advanced species in the galaxy agreeing that humanity needed to be contained. That framing was the source of the resolution's legitimacy. If the vote had been coerced, the legitimacy cracked. And in a body built on legal process, a crack in legitimacy was not a small thing. It was a fault line. I kept writing. I kept reading the legal archive. I ate my meals, which were nutritionally adequate and entirely joyless, and I kept working. And then, 38 days after my detention began, something happened that was not part of any plan I had made, because it came from the part of human nature that cannot be planned. The part that simply moves toward people who are hurting, without asking for permission first. A Kesson colony ship called the Marin's Light sent a distress signal. They were in the outer transit lanes 3 days from Conclave Prime, carrying 900 colonists. A cascading failure in their life support systems had contaminated 60% of their water supply, with a bacteria that the Kesson immune system could not handle. They had medical staff. They did not have the specific treatment compounds required. Their message to the Council Medical Authority was responded to with a 22-day estimated delivery timeline through proper channels. A human ship, the cargo hauler Constance Ford, operating out of a relay station on the edge of the quarantine zone, picked up the signal. The Constance Ford did not have permission to cross the quarantine boundary. Its captain, a quiet man named Owen Clark, filed a formal humanitarian exception request with the Council Border Authority and received an automated acknowledgement that his request would be reviewed within 14 business days. Owen Clark read that acknowledgement, set it aside, loaded his ship with every treatment compound in his medical stores, plus a field medical team of 4, and crossed the quarantine line. He docked with the Marin's Light 14 hours after the distress signal. His team went to work. Over the next 72 hours, they treated every affected colonist. 900 people who had been looking at a 22-day wait for proper channels were instead looking at a human medic named Callum Webbs, explaining, in broken but enthusiastic Kesson, how the treatment worked and what to watch for over the next week. Callum Webb and a Kesson physician named Sorath worked side by side in that medical bay for 3 days. By the end, they were finishing each other's sentences. Owen Clark returned through the quarantine line and was immediately detained by Council Border Enforcement for violation of Resolution 7 Omega. He submitted to the detention without resistance. His only comment recorded in the official enforcement log was, 900 people are alive. Process whatever you need to process. The story reached the council floor within hours. Sen forwarded me the transcript of the Border Enforcement report. I read it 3 times. Then I opened a new document and started writing a different kind of legal argument, one that was no longer purely defensive. I had found the gap I was looking for. I had found the door in the wall, and now I had a human being standing in front of it, arms crossed, having just demonstrated in the clearest possible terms what humanity actually was. A weapon made of helpfulness. A problem that solved other people's problems. A species that when given a locked door looked for a window, and when it found one, used it not to escape, but to hand something through to the person on the other side. The council had quarantined us for being dangerous. They had never stopped to define what dangerous actually meant, and that oversight was about to cost them everything. Architect Sen came to see me in person for the first time on the morning of my 53rd day of detention. He was smaller than I had realized from the observation gallery. Kesson were compact beings, roughly my height, with articulated limbs that moved with a precision that always reminded me of a very well-made machine. His eyes were large and faceted, a deep amber color, and they moved constantly, cataloging everything in the room in the way of someone who could not turn their observation instinct off even when they wanted to. He looked at my wall. I had covered most of it with printed pages from the legal archive, connected with thin lines I had drawn by hand. Dates, names, cross-references, a map of the council's own law arranged in the order that mattered to me. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You have been busy." "I have had a lot of time," I said. He sat down across from me, and we looked at each other for a moment with the shared understanding of 2 people who have been exchanging messages in code for weeks and are now meeting face to face for the first time. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. It was the question I had been saving. Sen was quiet for a moment. "Because I have watched this body for 40 years, he said. And in 40 years I have seen it solve nothing new. Everything it managed the same way a century ago. Every problem is addressed with the same tools. Every new species is measured against the same standard. And the standard was set by beings who have not experienced genuine difficulty in 800 years. He paused. "Your species arrived and in 300 years did what my people took 2,000 to do. The council called that a threat. I called it a question I wanted answered. I nodded. I found something, I said. I turned to the wall and pointed to a single page near the top, a scanned image of a text so old that the font was barely legible, from a species called the Arini who had gone extinct 4 centuries ago. The Arini had written most of the council's original charter documents before their sun went unstable and their world ended. Article 3, subsection 9, I said. The Arini wrote it as a protection against the council ever being used to permanently eliminate a species through administrative means rather than direct action. A quarantine cannot be made permanent without annual reaffirmation by a full council vote. But there is a condition attached. Reaffirmation can be challenged and forced into open review if the quarantined species can demonstrate continued participation in galactic welfare during the quarantine period. Sen's amber eyes were very still. "Owen Clark," he said. "Owen Clark," I agreed. 900 Kesson civilians alive because a human captain crossed a line he was not supposed to cross to help people he had no obligation to help. If that does not constitute participation in galactic welfare, then the phrase has no meaning. The council will argue that an illegal crossing cannot serve as a legal basis. The charter does not specify legal crossing. It specifies participation in galactic welfare. The Arini were very precise people. They wrote what they meant. I sat down. I need 2 things. I need a council member to file the reaffirmation challenge. And I need the Ohani. Why the Ohani? Because Leth paused before voting. And people who pause are people who are thinking. And thinking people can be talked to. I looked at him. "Can you get me a message to Ambassador Leth?" Sen thought for a moment. Then he stood up and straightened his coat with one precise motion. "I can do better than a message," he said. "The Ohani maintain an embassy suite on this station. As a council member, I can request an interdelegation meeting. If Ambassador Leth agrees, and if you happen to be present as part of my advisory staff on a temporary basis, that would be within the letter of the regulations, though perhaps not entirely within their spirit. I looked at him. Sen, yes? I think you are going to be very good at this. Something shifted in his expression. It might have been the Kessin equivalent of amusement. I had not yet learned all their tells, but I was learning fast. The meeting with Ambassador Leth happened 2 days later. Leth was everything I had hoped for, and a few things I had not expected. The Ohani had a long tradition of saying exactly what they meant, no more and no less, and Leth lived up to that tradition in the first 30 seconds of our conversation by looking at me and saying, I voted yes because I was afraid. I want you to know that I am not proud of it. I looked at this being, tall, robed in deep colors, with a face that carried the particular kind of tiredness that comes from carrying a secret for too long, and I felt a deep, involuntary warmth toward them that had nothing to do with strategy. I know, I said. I watched you vote. Our seers have been observing your species for 60 years, Leth said. Not officially, unofficially. The Ohani have always been interested in new things, and humanity was the newest thing in the galaxy. A pause. They concluded that you were not dangerous. The word they used was different. They called you transformative. In our tradition, that is a sacred category. I kept my face neutral, but something in my chest moved. I need your help, I said, not to fight the Council. To use the Council's own rules against a decision that should never have been made. Leth listened to everything I explained. When I was finished, there was a long silence. If we stand up in that chamber alongside Sen, Leth said, the Veth will not forgive it. No, I agreed. They will not. They may attempt to sanction the Kessin and Ohani delegations. They may. Another silence. Then Leth looked at me with something that I could only describe as recognition. You are going to make this very difficult for them, aren't you? Yes, I said simply, but not by fighting them. By holding up a mirror. The reaffirmation challenge was filed the following morning. Sen submitted it under his own authority. Leth co-signed it within the hour. The document cited Article 3, subsection 9 of the original Arini Charter. It cited the Constance Ford incident, the documented survival of 900 Kessin civilians, and the legal precedent from a 200-year-old case involving a species called the Dranek, who had successfully overturned a quarantine through similar means. The Council's response came within 6 hours. Elder Dara moved to table the challenge on procedural grounds. But here is the thing about an argument that stands on solid legal footing. It does not go away when someone tries to table it. It waits, and while it waits, other people read it. By the end of that day, I had received 4 private messages through channels I am still not going to describe publicly. 3 were from junior delegates whose names I had never heard. 1 was from the lead trade negotiator of a species that had voted yes on the quarantine 3 months earlier. All 4 messages said variations of the same thing. They had read the challenge. They wanted to know more. Meanwhile, something was happening in the Kessin colony, where Owen Clark's crew had worked. Something that no enforcement report would ever fully capture, because it was not an event. It was a relationship. Callum Webb and the Kessin physician Sorath had exchanged 42 messages since the medical mission ended. Sorath had shared her colony's research into a particularly difficult lung pathogen that the Kessin had been struggling with for a decade. Callum had shared 3 human research papers that approached the same problem from a completely different angle. Together, in messages sent across a quarantine line that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of contact, they had begun designing an approach that neither of them would have reached alone. They were not doing it because they were told to. They were doing it because they were both the kind of person who cannot look at an unsolved problem without wanting to fix it. The Council had spent months arguing that humanity's behavior was a threat to galactic stability. They had not once stopped to ask what galactic stability was actually for. And that question, quiet and patient and unstoppable, was beginning to find its way into rooms all over Conclave Prime. The Veth tabled the challenge, then they tabled it again. Then they called a procedural review committee that was designed to last 6 months. I waited. Humans are very good at waiting, especially when we are busy, and I was very, very busy. The fleet showed up on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had started keeping an Earth calendar on my terminal, partly for comfort, and partly because it annoyed my guards, who had no concept of a 7-day week and found the whole system baffling. I was in the middle of a meal, something the station kitchen produced that was meant to approximate rice and vegetables and mostly succeeded when Sen's message arrived. 2 words, fleet launched. I set down my fork and read the full intelligence brief that followed. The Veth Compliance Fleet, 40 warships. A coalition force assembled under the Emergency Powers Clause of the Council Charter, which allowed the deployment of military force against a quarantine system in the event of persistent violation of resolution terms. Earth had violated the quarantine terms 17 times by the Council's count, mostly in the form of humanitarian missions similar to Owen Clark's. Each one had been documented, protested, and ignored by Earth's government, which had publicly stated that it would continue to provide assistance to any being requesting it, regardless of what administrative boundary it required crossing to do so. I read the fleet composition: 40 ships, 6 species. Crews totaling approximately 12,000 individuals, most of them professional military or contracted enforcement personnel, from civilizations that maintained the Council as their primary economic partner. Then I read Earth's response, which Sen had included at the bottom of his brief. No warships deployed. No military mobilization. Instead, Earth's Unified Communications Authority had broadcast a single message on every standard frequency, translated into all 7 Council languages, plus the 11 languages of the non-Council species whose ships made up part of the fleet. The message had been sent not to the Council, not to the fleet commanders, but directly to the crews. I read it twice. We know you are coming. We know that most of you did not ask for this assignment. We know that some of your governments had no choice in this, and we know that many of you have no personal dispute with us. We are not going to fight you. We do not want this confrontation, and we do not believe you want it either. If any ship in your fleet requires fuel, emergency repair, or medical assistance at any point during this deployment, we will provide it with no conditions and no questions asked. Whatever happens between our governments, we do not believe that you are our enemies. We hope when this is over that you will agree. That was the entire message. No threats, no display of strength, no counter-mobilization. I sat with it for a long time. Then I went to the window and looked out at the stars. There is a thing that happens to people, all people, regardless of species, I think, when someone treats them with more decencies than the situation requires. Something goes quiet in them. Something that was braced for a fight stops bracing and has to figure out what to do with its hands. 3 ships from the Sulani contingent of the fleet accepted the fuel offer within 48 hours of crossing into Sol's outer system. Their engines were technically fine. They did not need the fuel. I believe, though I cannot prove it, that their captains used the offer as an excuse to make contact and see for themselves what kind of species extended a hand to a fleet that had come to quarantine them. The humans who received those ships were, by every account I later gathered, completely ordinary. Friendly, a little curious, fond of offering food, and entirely unbothered by the situation's strangeness. One of the Sulani captains, a woman named Vel Oran, who later testified before a council inquiry, said that she had expected hostility, or at least tension, and had instead spent 4 hours in a human cargo bay, eating something called flatbread, with a port engineer named Danny, who wanted to know what Sulani music sounded like. By the end of the first week, 7 ships had made contact. By the end of the second 11, the fleet was not mutinying. Mutiny would have required a decision, a moment, a line crossed. This was something different. This was 12,000 individuals slowly running out of reasons to treat the people across the boundary as the enemy they had been told to face. On Conclave Prime, the legal challenge I had filed was still buried in committee. The procedural review was still officially running, but the committee had begun meeting in sessions that ran twice as long as scheduled, because the members kept asking questions that required careful answers, and the careful answers kept raising more questions. Sen had been working a parallel track. He had gone back through the internal records of the quarantine vote and found the documentation of the private meetings in which the Marathi, Sovin, and Drakel had been pressured. Not formal records, those had been kept off the main archive. But the council building was old, and its communication logs were thorough, and Sen was extraordinarily patient and extraordinarily good at finding things that other people believed were hidden. He brought the documents to me on the 61st day of my detention, sliding a data chip across the table with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been working toward a specific moment for a very long time. I looked at the chip. Then I looked at him. "This is it," I said. "This is it," he agreed. I held the chip and thought about what it meant. The quarantine had been presented to the galaxies as a unified decision. Every advanced species, after careful consideration, agreeing that humanity needed to be contained. The reality was that 8% of the vote had been coerced under threat of economic retaliation. In a body that required unanimous consent for quarantine resolutions, 8% was everything. The resolution was not just challengeable, it was void. Elder Dara knew. She had to know. Which meant the quarantine had never been a legal finding. It had been a power play, wearing the costume of a legal finding, and the costume had just come off. I spent 2 days preparing for the floor session. I did not write a speech. I prepared an argument, which is a different thing. A speech is for moving people. An argument is for being correct. I wanted to be correct first and moving second, in that order, because the correctness was the only thing that would last. I also made a list of the 12 species currently represented in the council chamber, whose governments had, at various points during the quarantine, conducted private trade with Earth in technical violation of the resolution. I was not going to threaten them. I was going to thank them publicly for having the judgment to recognize that the resolution was wrong and act accordingly, and I was going to do it in a way that made it impossible for them to pretend afterward that they had believed in the quarantine all along. The Ohani secured me emergency speaking rights. Leth had spent 6 weeks quietly building the coalition of species needed to force the motion, and on the morning of the session, I walked from the observer gallery to the edge of the central platform and waited while the chamber filled. Elder Dara looked at me from her seat. I met her gaze and held it. I am going to tell you what I said, not word for word, but in the way that it felt. I told them about Owen Clark. I told them about Callum Webb and Sarath, who at that point had been corresponding for 2 months and had produced a joint research framework for the Kesson lung pathogen that 3 independent reviewers had called the most promising approach in a decade. I told them about the 7 fleet ships whose crews had accepted fuel and conversation instead of confrontation. Then I opened the data on the wall screen, a right available to any recognized speaker, and I put up a century of comparative data. Every species that had maintained economic or research contact with Earth was on the list. On one side, their scientific advancement rates over the past 100 years. On the other, the species that had maintained strict separation from Earth, including the Veth. The numbers needed no commentary. The gap was wide enough to see from the back of the chamber. I said, you have spent 6 years calling us a threat to stability. I would like to suggest that you have confused stability with stagnation. These are not the same thing. Stability is a system that can absorb new information and keep functioning. Stagnation is a system that has stopped being able to absorb new information and calls its own rigidity a virtue. I looked at Elder Dara. The Veth have not produced a new patent in 800 years. They have not established a new research partnership in 3 centuries. They have not sent an exploratory mission beyond known space in 400 years. This is not age. This is the result of spending your energy managing everything around you instead of growing yourself. The chamber was very quiet. I pulled up the coercion documents. I walked through them methodically. I named the meetings. I quoted the communications. I did not editorialize. I let the documents do the work. Then I said the 12 names. The 12 species whose governments had quietly traded with Earth during the quarantine. I said, I am not standing here to reproach any of you. I am standing here to thank you. You knew what you were doing. You knew it was right. You did it anyway. That is what this body was supposed to be for, before it became a mechanism for the oldest voices to remain the loudest. I had one more thing to say, and I had been saving it for the end. The quarantine resolution is void, I said. Not because humanity is innocent of being unusual, or difficult, or relentlessly, and sometimes exhaustingly engaged with everything around us. We are all of those things, and we are not apologizing for any of them. It is void because the vote that created it was not free. 8% of that vote was coerced. In this chamber's own charter, a quarantine requires unanimous free consent. It did not have it. It never had it. I placed the data chip on the platform's submission surface, which was the equivalent of entering evidence into the record. I am filing a motion to nullify Resolution 7 Omega on the grounds of procedural violation, I said. And I am asking every member of this body who voted yes under pressure to now vote the way they actually believe. I stepped back from the platform. What happened next took approximately 40 seconds. Elder Dara stood up. Her voice was controlled, but not quite as controlled as usual. She said, "This council moves to close the current session pending review of the speaker's submitted materials. Given the serious procedural questions raised, I am further moving to suspend this body pending restructuring, effective immediately." She meant it as a death blow. Suspend the council, eliminate the forum, remove the mechanism through which the challenge could be heard. If there was no council, there was no vote. If there was no vote, the quarantine remained in a legal gray area that the Veth could manage indefinitely. The chamber was still. I looked at the motion, I looked at what it meant, and then very slowly I started to clap. not in mockery, not in anger, in the specific deliberate way of someone who's watching a trap close on the person who said it. Because what Elder Dara had just done, in an attempt to preserve her power, was announced to 26 other species that she was willing to destroy the institution they all depended on, rather than let it produce a result she did not like. And every one of them had just heard it. The silence after Elder Dara's announcement lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Then Ambassador Leth of the Ohani stood up. Then Sen stood up. Then the lead delegate of the Marathi, one of the 3 species that had been coerced, stood up, and the look on his face was not fear. It was the look of a person who had been waiting a long time to stand up and had finally been given the reason. By the end of the minute, 9 delegates were standing. Dara looked at the standing figures. She looked at me. Something moved across her face that I had not seen there before. Not anger, which I had seen plenty of, but something older and quieter. Something that looked like the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a structure in place through force of will for a very long time and has just felt the first real tremor in the foundation. She called for the suspension motion to be voted on immediately. It failed. Not dramatically. It was close. But it failed because the rules she was using required a supermajority, and 7 of the species whose vote she was counting on had just watched her announce that she would rather have no council than a council that disagreed with her. The session did not end, it transformed. For 3 hours, the chamber conducted the most contentious, loud, and genuinely alive debate I had witnessed in 6 years of sitting in the observer gallery. Species that had not openly disagreed with the Veth in decades were speaking. Junior delegates who had spent their careers in procedural silence were raising points of order. The coercion documents that I had submitted were passed from terminal to terminal, read and reread, argued over, cross-referenced against the Charter's own definitions of free consent. Dara did not yield the floor easily. I had not expected her to. She was a formidable person. I want to be honest about that, because reducing her to a simple obstacle would be both unfair and inaccurate. She had run the Galactic Council for over a century, and she had done so with intelligence and a genuine belief that stability served the good of everyone. She was not wrong that stability mattered. She was wrong about what threatened it. She argued that the coercion evidence was circumstantial. Sen rebutted with the communication logs, time-stamped and archived. She argued that the Arini Charter Clause had been superseded by later amendments. I had anticipated this and had the countertext ready. She argued that humanity behavior remained a genuine concern regardless of procedural questions, and this was the argument that lingered longest in the chamber because it was not entirely without truth. I stood up again to address it. You are not wrong that humanity is unusual, I said. We move fast. We connect with people we probably should not always connect with. We cross lines that the existing order has drawn for reasons that seem logical until you examine them. We have been doing this since before we had language. Helping people who are not our family, traveling further than we needed to, building things that no single generation would live to see finished. I looked around the chamber. You called that a threat. I call it the reason we are still here, and I would ask you to consider whether a galaxy that has been stable for 800 years, stable in the way a machine is stable when it has stopped moving, might benefit from a little of the particular kind of trouble that humans bring. The Marathi delegate spoke next. He was brief and quiet and very clear. He said that his government had voted yes under duress, that they had known at that time that the resolution was unjust, and that they were rescinding their support with immediate effect and requesting formal documentation of the coercive communications be entered into the Council's permanent record. The Sovan delegate followed. Then the Drakel. 3 votes gone. The resolution had never had 27 free votes. Now it visibly had fewer than it needed. Dara called for a recess. I think she needed one. I think she was, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, genuinely uncertain about how the next hour was going to go. That uncertainty was not something I took pleasure in. I want to be clear about that. I had no interest in humiliating her. I had no interest in being right at her expense. I was interested in a single outcome, the quarantine ending, and ending in a way that could not be reversed or worked around. During the recess, Sen and I sat in the Ohani embassy with 3 other delegates and worked through what came next. Not the immediate legal question, which was nearly resolved. The larger question, the one that the last 3 hours had made unavoidable. The Council was not going to survive this in its current form. Not because anyone had tried to destroy it, but because its foundational problem had been exposed. It was not a council of equals deliberating freely. It was a hierarchy of age with a democratic costume on, and the costume had just been removed in front of everyone. Even the species that still supported the Veth leadership had seen what Dara had done when her authority was challenged, and seeing it had planted a question in them that would not stop growing. The question was, if she would do that to humanity, what might she do to us? I had not caused that question. The question had always been there, waiting. I had just provided the occasion for people to say it out loud. We talked for an hour. Then the session resumed. Dara came back to the platform. She stood very straight. I will give her this. She had composure. Even at the end of a session that had clearly not gone the way she planned, she stood straight and spoke with authority. Given the procedural challenges that have been raised today, she said, and the evidence submitted regarding the conduct of the original vote, this council acknowledges that Resolution 7 Omega requires formal review. A special committee will be formed. Article 5, I said, every head turned. Article 5, subsection 2, I said. A resolution found to have been passed through coercive means does not require committee review. It requires immediate nullification on the floor by vote. The charter is very clear. Dara looked at me. The look lasted a long time. You have done your reading, she said. I had time, I said. The vote was called. Resolution 7 Omega, maintain, modify, or nullify. 17 votes for nullification, 6 abstentions. 4 votes to maintain. The 4 were Veth-aligned species whose governments were too economically dependent on Veth trade to vote their conscience. I understood. I did not hold it against them. The quarantine was over. In the quiet that followed, I stood at the edge of the speaking platform and felt something ease out of my body that had been there so long I had stopped noticing it. 6 years of smiling in corridors where nobody smiled back. 6 years of filing proposals that were never answered. 6 years of sitting slightly lower than everyone else in a room, and telling myself that position did not define standing. Dara left the platform without speaking to me. I did not chase her, but I sent her a message that evening from my terminal in what was no longer my holding room. It said, I would like to meet with you tomorrow, not as a diplomatic formality, privately, as two people who are both going to have to figure out what comes next. I am bringing coffee. I hope you will come. She came. She sat across the table from me in a small meeting room with no ceremonial furniture, and she looked older than she did on the platform. Not weaker, just more honestly tired. You are not angry, she said. I was angry for about 48 hours, I said honestly. Then I got busy. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. She had tried it once before, a year ago, at a station function, and I had gambled that she remembered it and was quiet for a while. I was not wrong that you are unusual, she said. No, I agreed. You were not wrong about that. I was wrong about what it meant. Yes. Another silence. What do you want? She asked. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question. The same thing I wanted 6 years ago when I arrived here, I said. A seat at the table. Not because humanity deserves it more than anyone else. Because every species deserves a seat, including yours, and a table where people are afraid to speak is not a table, it is a performance. She drank her coffee. She set the cup down very precisely. I do not know how to build what you are describing, she said. Neither do I said. But I know several people who are very good at building things they have never built before. That is, I should mention, one of our more useful qualities. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. The precursor to a smile, maybe. The place where a smile might eventually grow if given enough time. You are very strange beings, she said. Thoroughly, I agreed. The Galactic Assembly convened for the first time 14 months after the nullification of Resolution 7 Omega. Not a council. The word was chosen deliberately. A council implied hierarchy, someone at the top, someone at the bottom, a structure of seniority and rank that would inevitably, over time, calcify into exactly what we had just dismantled. An assembly implied something different. It implied a group of people who had gathered for a specific reason, without a predetermined arrangement of who was more important than whom. 31 species, equal standing. Rotating chairmanship, 1 year at a time, determined by a lottery rather than by age or size or economic power. No observer-only seats, no tiered voting systems. Every species with 1 vote and every vote with equal weight. It was imperfect. I want to be honest about that, because writing about it as a triumphant conclusion would be a misrepresentation of the actual experience, which was messy and loud and frequently frustrating in ways that only humans probably found energizing. The first session ran 11 hours. 6 proposals were introduced, debated, amended, redebated, re-amended, and eventually either passed in a form that nobody was entirely happy with or tabled for the next session. The Kesson delegation twice asked for recesses to conduct internal processing. Their decision-making architecture required group synthesis that could not be rushed. The Ohani ambassador gave a 20-minute philosophical statement that was technically relevant to the agenda item, but which 3 other delegations requested be summarized in under 4 minutes for the record. One species, the Drakel, got into a heated technical disagreement with the Preethian delegate over the wording of a trade protocol clause that lasted 40 minutes and was eventually resolved when both parties realized they had been using the word exclusive to mean 2 entirely different things. I sat at the table, not at the edge of a gallery slightly below everyone else. At the table. It felt different than I had expected. I had expected it to feel like a conclusion, like reaching the top of something and looking down at the distance traveled. It did not feel like that at all. It felt like the beginning of a very long, very complicated, very alive thing that was going to require enormous amounts of patience and creativity, and the specific kind of stubbornness that does not become bitterness. It felt like work, the best kind of work, the kind where you are not entirely sure what you are building, but you know it matters. Owen Clark was not at the assembly. He was back on his cargo route, which had been reinstated along with full trading rights for all human vessels the week after the quarantine ended. He had been offered a commendation by Earth's diplomatic corps and had, by all accounts, responded by saying that he appreciated the thought, but he had a shipping schedule to catch up on, and would it be possible to send the certificate to his home address? Callum Webb was not at the assembly either. He was on the Kesson colony still. He and Sarath had completed their preliminary research framework and were 3 months into the clinical trial phase of a treatment that was already showing results nobody had predicted. Sarath had learned enough standard language to communicate without a translator in everyday situations. Callum had learned enough Kesson to argue, which Sarath said was the truest test of linguistic competency. Danny, the port engineer who had spent 4 hours feeding flatbread to a Sulani fleet captain, was also not at the assembly. He was at his regular post, as far as I know, probably doing exactly what he always did, showing up, doing his job well, and being genuinely interested in whatever person happened to be standing in front of him. None of them were there because they had not been trying to change anything. They had not woken up thinking about galactic politics or legal precedents or the long arc of species relations. They had woken up thinking about the people in front of them and what those people needed and whether they could help. That was the thing that had undone the Galactic Council. Not a military campaign, not a political strategy, not even my legal argument, which was, I should admit, a much smaller part of the story than it might appear from the inside. What undid the Galactic Council was the accumulation of small, genuine acts by people who could not look at a problem without wanting to solve it, and could not look at a stranger without wanting to know them. The councils had legislated against that quality in us. They had called it dangerous. They had built a wall to contain it, and the wall had not held because the thing they were trying to contain was not aggression or ambition or hunger for power. It was helpfulness, it was curiosity. It was the particular human inability to encounter another being and remain indifferent to their well-being. You cannot quarantine that, you cannot regulate it or contain it or vote it away. You can only encounter it and be changed by the encounter and eventually decide whether you want to keep resisting the change or start finding out where it leads. On the last day of the first assembly session, I walked out through the main entrance of the new assembly hall, a different building from Conclave Prime's old chamber, one that had been deliberately designed with no observer galleries and no platform elevated above the rest, and stood in the long corridor outside. Sen fell into step beside me. He was carrying a stack of data tablets with the efficient energy of someone who had not slowed down in 14 months and had no intention of starting. Ambassador Leth walked on my other side, robes moving quietly, expression carrying that particular Ahani quality of being simultaneously at rest and paying complete attention to everything. 11 hours, Sen said. The first session, 11 hours for 6 items. That seems about right, I said. It will take years to develop functional procedure, he said. This was not a complaint. It was an observation, stated with the tone of someone who finds the project interesting. Years, I agreed. At minimum. Leth said, our seers have been updating their assessments. I looked at them. What do they say now? They say the word transformative was accurate, Leth said. They say they wish they had trusted it sooner. A pause. They also say that whatever happens next will be very loud. I laughed. It came up from somewhere deep and real, the laugh of a person who has been waiting a long time to feel exactly this kind of uncomplicated happiness. That, I said, is the most accurate thing anyone has said about humanity in the entire time I have worked here. We walked out into the light. I thought about all the ships moving out there beyond the station's hull, cargo haulers and research vessels and fleet ships, whose crews had gone home to complicated conversations with their governments, medical transports and relay stations and colony ships, with names like Marin's Light, making their slow, steady way between the stars. I thought about a man named Owen Clark somewhere out there with a shipping schedule, and a doctor named Callum, who had learned a new language through the process of arguing in it, and a port engineer named Danny, who had probably already made friends with someone new since the last time I thought about him. I thought about the Veth, about Elder Dara sitting in a session for the first time in 8 centuries as one voice among many, rather than the loudest voice in the room, learning what it felt like to listen more than she spoke. She had not found it easy. I had not expected her to. But she had come back to the second session, and the third, and she was still coming, which told me something about her that I had not fully credited before. She actually cared. She had always cared. She had simply confused caring for the galaxy with controlling it, and the difference had taken a crisis to reveal. That was not unique to the Veth. I had met that confusion in many forms, across many species, including my own. The work was not finished. It would not be finished in my lifetime. The Galactic Assembly was a beginning, not an end, and beginnings are inherently uncomfortable because they have not yet developed the rhythms and habits that make complex systems feel manageable. Every session would produce new disagreements. Every new member species would bring new assumptions that would have to be examined and argued through. Every generation of delegates would inherit problems they did not create, and solutions that had not been invented yet. I found this completely acceptable. Humans have always been better at beginnings than at conclusions. We are restless by nature, curious by design, and constitutionally incapable of looking at an unfinished thing and deciding it is good enough. That quality has caused us no end of difficulty. It has also produced every worthwhile thing we have ever made. The Galactic Council turned against Earth and sealed its own fate the moment it assumed that the worst thing a species could be was hard to control. We were never trying to control anything. We were trying to get to know our neighbors. We have a lot of neighbors now, and we are just getting started.